Welcome to another discussion on Financing Jamaica, where we speak with the Minister of Finance and the Public Service, Dr. the Honourable Nigel Clarke. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning.
Our topic today is the Microfinance Act, which was recently passed in Parliament. The Act passed in both houses, both chambers of Parliament last month. What does this piece of legislation really seek to do?
The Microcredit Act. The Microcredit Act seeks to license and regulate firms that operate in the microcredit sector. It seeks to promote an environment, a business environment where there is greater transparency and price discovery that benefits consumers. It seeks to regulate practices and market conduct to outlaw intimidatory and tactics and predatory lending. And it seeks to promote a competitive landscape where consumers can benefit from better priced microcredit services on better terms.
Why has the licensing and regulation of microcredit institutions taken so long? They perform a very important function in the economy. Why has it taken all this time?
That's a very good question. I mean, the microcredit sector has grown exponentially over the past maybe 20 years, in particular over the past 10 years. And there has been quite some effort over time to bring the sector under the regulatory umbrella of the state. As you can imagine, regulating a sector that is grown is far more, or starting to regulate a sector that is grown is far more difficult than if you started at the very beginning. So it involved a lot of dialogue with the sector, with participants. Of course, there would have been objection from some at first, and some of the measures that the government was proposing probably weren't, needed to be moderated. So it took a lot of dialogue to get where we are. In fact, the original version of this bill was tabled in Parliament 2 years ago, and that bill would have been worked on for the previous 2 years. So we're certainly we've been working on this for a number of years, and it just takes time because it's a large sector and a lot of factors to consider. And at the end of the day, we want a bill that has democratic legitimacy, and so involving stakeholders is a key part of that.
You mentioned things like predatory pricing. There's also the issue of excessive interest rates not justified by risks. Tell us about the background to some of those unsavory practices in the sector, and why it is important to stamp them out. What's the real benefit to the country?
Yes, so there have been numerous reports. There are over 200 firms that operate in the microcredit space. And I should start by saying that there are many exemplary firms in the microcredit space who treat their customers with respect, who are honest, and who are fair. However, we have had numerous complaints of entities that do not operate in that way, that have used threatening tactics, intimidation, threats of violence in order to collect on their loans. Once you lend someone, you are allowed to call or email to ensure that you are paid. But you are not allowed to threaten that borrower with physical violence or to intimidate them to that if they don't pay, you will cause them harm. This does not allow for a deepening of financial inclusion. So the aim of the bill is to broaden and deepen financial inclusion. What does that mean? It means that more and more Jamaicans have access to better priced financial services. if you operate by intimidation and threats, and if your industry has a reputation for that, of embarrassing people into pain, and so forth, what's going to happen is a lot of people will stay away from being customers, and that's not what we want. We want more and more people to see going to a financial institution, whether it's a microcredit or otherwise, as an option that is open to them. So it's about broadening access for Jamaicans by outlawing these practices that are repulsive. And this is the government stepping in on behalf of the consumer and saying, no more. You can lend, you can collect, but don't intimidate. Don't threaten violence. Don't threaten to harm people in order to collect on what you have lent.
Financial inclusion requires financial literacy to some extent. What element of the Act or any accompanying measures that will increase financial literacy?
A good question. So the Act requires, first of all, full disclosure on the time that you sign on a loan. We have had complaints in the past that people are not aware of what they have signed. And some of the charges can be quite punitive and some of the rates can be high. So the Act requires when the borrower takes out the loan or signs for the loan, everything must be disclosed in one sort of sheet of paper. The interest rates, the fees, the interest rates charged if the fees are late, if the payments are late, the term of the loan, etc. And very importantly, you must disclose the effective annual interest rate. Now, what is the effective annual interest rate? What that means, sometimes microcredit institutions may quote a loan in weekly payments or in monthly payments. So you borrow $15,000 and you are supposed to pay back $2,000 a week for the next 20 weeks. Or you borrow $10,000 and you're supposed to pay back $3,000 a month for the next 6 months. The customer needs to know which of those is a better deal. And the only way that they can know it's a better deal, both of those offers can be reduced to a single variable, which is the effective annual interest rate, which tells you how much this loan is costing me. And so this offer is better than that offer. And by having effective annual interest rates, consumers can make informed decisions. Right now, consumers are not really aware of which offer is a better offer. Borrowing for 7 days at paying back this amount per day, or paying back this amount per week, or that amount per month. And by requiring that the effective annual interest rate is disclosed to the borrower, we empower the borrower to make better decisions. But it goes beyond that. What the law also requires is that all of the fees are added, and the effective annual interest rate takes into account the fees. So if somebody offers you a loan of $30,000, you have to pay back $3,000 for 20 weeks, and you have an upfront fee of $10,000 or upfront fee of $2,000. And another guy says, you borrow $30,000, you pay back $1,000 a week for 50 weeks, but you have a $5,000 charge upfront. Right? Which of those is a better deal for the customer? Well, what you do is you take the fees and you add it to all the interests that they have to pay, and then you compute the effective annual interest rate. And what we're doing by making that mandatory is that the consumer is empowered to make choices in their best interest. And so the law, this Microcredit Act, is empowering the Jamaican citizen, is empowering the Jamaican consumer.
In asking for clarity on the effective annual interest rate, the inclusion of fees and so on, you're not asking for uniformity in charges and interest rates in the sector?
No, not at all. In fact, the sector has over 200 players, and so you're going to get a variation of products. The idea is we want those products to be able to compete in the marketplace with full information. Okay? When customers are not aware because there's obfuscation or there is willful misleading an attitude or environment where you mislead customers, that is not healthy. It does not promote the growth of the sector and is harmful to the consumer. So what we want is for full disclosure of pricing, and customers will make their choices. They will maybe go for a more expensive product because it's more convenient. Another product is probably linked, has an electronic link to their bank account. It's easier for them to pay. So people will make choices based on different reasons, but we want those to be informed choices.
At the point of the tabling of the bill in Parliament, there were accusations of the government rushing the legislation this time around. How do you respond?
I don't know how we can be rushing the legislation when we first tabled it 2 years ago and have been in dialogue with stakeholders since then. We have been talking for a long time and engaging stakeholders for a long time, but the time for talking has to come to an end. It so happened as well that we had an international commitment to get the legislation passed by a certain date, and we were able to fulfill that commitment, and that also had to be taken into account.
And that commitment has a bearing on Jamaica remaining compliant with the Financial Action Task Force requirements aimed at combating money laundering and anti-financing of terrorism. Can you explain to us the linkage between the Microcredit Act and those commitments?
Yeah, that's a very relevant and good question. One of the reasons for the Act as well is for regulating the sector, is to ensure that microcredit institutions cannot be used and leveraged as a tool to launder ill-gotten gains or to launder criminal proceeds. An unregulated microcredit sector of the size that we have is susceptible and vulnerable to be used to launder criminal proceeds. If you think about it, where do microcredit institutions get the money to lend? Well, they get the money either from borrowing from established institutions or from the pockets of the shareholders or the pockets of friends of shareholders. If we don't have a system that ensures that shareholders and directors are fit and proper, then what you can have is you can have ill-gotten gains and criminal proceeds being funneled through microcredit institutions, and that would be a perfect way to legitimize those proceeds. That's a huge danger to the Jamaican financial system and a danger, therefore, to the international financial system. And as a result, in Jamaica's own interest, but also in the interest of the international financial system, we had to bring this sector under regulation to ensure that every single entity that operates in the microcredit space is licensed, their directors and shareholders are fit and proper, that they abide by certain practices of disclosure and of transparency, that they report on an annual basis to the Bank of Jamaica, and so forth. And therein closing that loophole where they were previously susceptible and vulnerable to money laundering risk. There was a consequence as well, right? A lot of those microcredit institutions were being cut off from commercial banks in Jamaica. So a microcredit institution that lends money needs to have a bank account to operate, right? I think that's obvious. Because they were unregulated and because they were open and susceptible to the risk of criminal proceeds being laundered through these institutions, there are commercial banks in Jamaica who took the stance that they would not bank them. Because if they banked them, they would have the risk of those microcredit institutions contaminating the bank with which they had a relationship. So the problem was metastasizing. And as such, a lot of players in the microcredit space were very anxious to get the law passed because it would signal to local commercial banks and to the international community that there is a plan in place to bring the sector under the regulatory auspices of the central bank and thereby provide the assurance that these institutions are above board and fit and proper, and as such, commercial banks can openly extend their banking facilities to the microcredit institutions without the fear or risk of themselves being contaminated.
It's in addition to banking relationships, the openness and access to credit for on lending would have been opened not just
absolutely
locally, but also internationally.
Absolutely. Once the microcredit institutions now are regulated and they're under the supervision of the BOJ, that means that their standards have to be at that level. Yes, it opens more of them to receiving loans and grant funding from international institutions. What happens now is that it's just the very large ones who have have had a self-regulatory environment and therefore have good practices historically. Those have been open to international assistance. When we regulate the entire sector, right, and raise the standards, it provides more opportunity for all players in the microcredit space.
And on the global level, as you've been suggesting, the absence of such a law really created a bad impression for the country.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. This was a sore point, to be frank, a sore point, because in a place where we have a very high level of criminal activity, just by measure of homicidal violence, okay, and violence that can be attributed to gangs. I mean, gangs are economic enterprises. Economic enterprises operate on money. And given the prevalence of criminal enterprises in Jamaica, the wide proliferation of 200 microcredit entities that are just wide open to being used by criminal enterprises or abused was too great a risk. And certainly the perception is even more damaging than the reality, internationally. So this is an area that had to be addressed and had to be closed and had to be addressed in an open way where we dialogued with stakeholders, we explained to them what the intentions and aims were. And I must say that they cooperated. There are two umbrella agencies for the microcredit sector, and they were very cooperative, even if there were points in which there were disagreement. I mean, ultimately, when we took the bill and passed it in Parliament, we had the, notwithstanding some noises that were made, we had the nod from, the large umbrella group.
Right. One of those groups, JAMFIN, the Jamaica Microfinancing Association Limited, has said through their chairman that while the consultation was ongoing in the development of the legislation, once the draft was put together and about to be brought to Parliament, there was not enough consultation or opportunity for the industry to review or get a sense of what was actually included in the draft legislation.
Yeah, I heard that comment as well, but I also have comments from the same association where they said they were satisfied with the measures in the bill. Not enough is a very subjective term, and reasonable minds can disagree on that. We have been in extensive dialogue. An entire bill was tabled February 26, 2019, which is 2 years ago, 24 months ago. And we've had many rounds of dialogue since then. the bill does not reflect every single wish of that umbrella organization. However, the main issues that they had and the main challenges were addressed.
How do you respond to the included in that criticism is that the law is not developmental enough of the sector, but rather punitive. It is punishing those bad actors, as you have pointed out, there are some. But they have been making the point, as you just made the point, that there are also good actors in good standing, exemplary institutions within the sector. But there's a feeling that there is a focus on punishment.
Okay. I've heard that point of view being expressed as well. Here's what I'll say. The law gives a year for the enterprises in the microcredit space to get organized and get licensed. So that's 12 months. The law was passed in January. It does not take, the provisions do not take effect until a year has passed, meaning that if they're required to be licensed, if they're not licensed in June or July, that's not a problem. They have 12 months to get licensed. Thereafter, yes, indeed, there are sanctions that are applied for entities who do not comply with the provisions of the Act. And I've just described the environment in which, and you yourself have relayed to me in the course of this interview, how Jamaica is sometimes perceived internationally, and the realities in Jamaica and in this space. And yes, there are good companies, there are great companies who abide by great principles and great practices operating in this sector. However, we do have challenges, and the law makes it unequivocally clear that the government is absolutely serious on bringing regularity and good practice to the sector. And that can't happen unless there are sanctions for not abiding by what the law prescribes. That's unavoidable. And the sanctions are a measure of the seriousness with which the government views compliance in the sector.
Right. The legislation allows for a 5-year review. Is that too short, as some people might be, or too long, as some people might be saying, a time for a new piece of legislation to come up for review?
I would say it is realistic. I've seen in many other pieces of legislation that we have 3 years for review. 3 years comes and nothing happens. 5, nothing happens. So we just chose a realistic time. The legislative agenda is always packed. There's a lot of competition for resources, for the parliamentary time, for the resources of the draftsmen and the Attorney General's chambers. Any time period less than that would be impractical and would be engaged in fooling ourselves. So we chose a practical time, and where we will be able to engage in a revision, to see what elements we want to keep, what elements we want to change.
Supervision of microcredit institutions will fall to the Bank of Jamaica as the regulatory authority. But the Consumer Affairs Commission has some special functions under this act. Can you tell us about that construct for supervision and the CSEs?
Good question. So the Bank of Jamaica is responsible for the licensing and the prudential regulation of the sector. So making sure that everyone who operates a microcredit service, licensed entity, making sure that people are fit and proper, approving of mergers or sales or change in shareholding, approval of change in head office, perusing the annual reports and the financial records of the entity, regulating in terms of their sort of financial and fit and proper requirements. There's also the market conduct practice. And the market conduct part of the law is how are you conducting yourself in the marketplace. And that falls under the Consumer Affairs Commission. And the Consumer Affairs Commission has a general market conduct focus altogether. The Bank of Jamaica while it may have a code of practice for the institutions that it supervises, it's not a market conduct institution, hence that bifurcation. And under the market conduct side of the law, which the Consumer Affairs Commission has responsibility for, that's where we require that microcredit institutions disclose pricing, disclose the effective annual interest rate, don't engage in bullying or intimidatory or tactics or threatening of violence, and provide statements to their customers whenever they require them, provide a statement of account of all the loan, how much they have paid back, how much they owe, what the fees and charges are going to be. That's all under the Consumer Affairs Commission. And very importantly, under that aspect of the Act, the Jamaican citizen can bring complaints to a government authority. Today, if you are in with a microcredit institution in Dallas, Westmoreland, or in Yalas in St. Thomas, and you have a problem, somebody has done you wrong, apart from the court, I mean, you don't have a regulatory body to whom you can appeal. And that's a problem, yeah? Because it's usually the customers of microcredit institutions are usually micro enterprises, or there are low-income individuals or persons in the informal sector. So what this does is it sets up the Consumer Affairs Commission as the entity to whom aggrieved persons can look if the market conduct of the microcredit institution is below standard.
One of the objectives set out in the Act is the creation of financial opportunities for Jamaicans, even as you protect them, say, through the Consumer Affairs Commission. Can you speak to the creation of opportunities? How does the legislation create financial opportunities for the ordinary Jamaican?
Well, it creates financial opportunities that are well priced and that are at a good standard by making the industry more transparent. And by making the industry more transparent, it elevates competition, because that information now is available generally. What is his effective interest rate? What is her effective interest rate? What should mine be in order to compete? And the industry has so many players that collusion is not really that easy. So it provides opportunity from that sense.
Many low-income households rely, say, on their partner draw every week or 2 weeks, same-day loans, payday loans, to make ends meet from day to day, to send their children to school. How is the government ensuring that in regulating the sector, which it must, you're not reducing opportunities and access for the small man or the small woman?
Right, but we're not regulating partner. I mean, the partner system is outside of this space of microcredit institutions. So that can coexist in an unregulated fashion. So your question is, in the microcredit space, are we concerned that regulation can reduce the size of the industry? Well, I believe that regulation can reduce the size of the industry that's geared towards bad practices and bad habits and injuring and intimidating and threatening Jamaicans. The law will certainly reduce that. But what the law does for the entities that are willing to abide by good practices is that it increases their opportunity, because that now becomes the standard. They don't have to compete with people who are engaged in bullying tactics and so forth, and that side of the market will grow and expand.
Right. In addition to the possibility of market reduction, which you've adequately addressed, there is the concern of additional costs to doing business with the new requirements for reporting, putting in new prudential financial systems within your operations to ensure that you meet the law. How have you, as a government, balanced that consideration in ensuring the full regulation and protection in the sector?
Yes, so that's a unavoidable consequence. Abiding by the law and operating in a regulated environment will come with costs. You have to submit audited reports, so you definitely have to have your accounts audited. Well, but it's costs that are necessary, right? It's not costs that are unnecessary. But as compared with an unregulated environment, it is definitely more expensive to participate in a regulated space. And that's something that we've tried to minimize, but it's an unavoidable cost, but it's a cost that ultimately provides for a better service to the public. What you might see happening, and I've seen advertisements or speeches or utterances to this regard, you're going to have some mergers in the sector because it may no longer be viable to operate at below a particular threshold. So we had, the World and His Wife is in the microcredit business. There are over 200 firms that we are aware of, and many more who operate below the radar. It may not be feasible, to have a microcredit business. Let's make a number that lends $20 million a year, or choose a number. It may be that in order to, given the margins involved in the business, given the cost of administration, and now the cost of regulation, that you have to be at a certain size. So you might get players merging. You might have players who don't want to come under this regulatory ambit and therefore willing to merge or to sell to other players. I'd expect to see over the next few years some consolidation in the industry, which is not a bad thing.
What are the implications for formalizing the underground economy?
Well, not the underground economy. The underground economy has a different connotation to the informal economy. I think what you mean is informal economy, yes. This alone will not formalize the informal economy. However, it is certainly a step towards greater formalization of the informal economy. And, the informal economy is just a reflection of our level of development as a country. It's not a statement on the individuals or on the people. There's no set of people in Jamaica who are formal people and other people are informal people. It's a term just to characterize those who are, conform to certain practice and are measured, and whose activities are reported on and so forth. This will certainly increase the size of the formal economy relative to the informal, but it's only a step.
One would expect that another piece of legislation which is on the cards is the Credit Union Special Provisions Act. And one would have expected that to have been almost a companion piece of legislation to the Microcredit Act. Is this the best way forward? And can you say why the two have not been brought at the same time?
Well, that's a very insightful question. We have been developing them at the same time, but dialoguing with a different set of stakeholders. The microcredit institutions on one hand, and the credit unions on another hand. And the pace has been different. And rather than artificially wait, these are two different spaces entirely. We decided to just go ahead with the microcredit space. The credit union bill, however, is far advanced, and we hope to be tabling that hopefully in the upcoming financial year. It's a very important piece of legislation, especially, and it's made even more important in this crisis, that one of the advantages for the credit unions coming under the regulatory window of the central bank is that the central bank is the lender of last resorts, and they have access to that backstop in the event that they need it. We'd have seen in this crisis, there were reports in the newspaper several months ago that the central bank had actually, exercised its discretion to lend to certain credit unions for whom liquidity was important in the middle of the pandemic. So, credit unions have over $100 billion of the deposits of Jamaican citizens. And by bringing them under the regulatory ambit of the central bank, we just provide greater protection to those citizens.
Minister, please remind us when the Act comes into effect.
Microcredit entities will have 12 months to get ready for the Act, which is to put themselves in a place to be licensed by the BOJ and to fulfill all of the other requirements of the Act, ensure that their directors are fit and proper and their shareholders are fit and proper. By next year, January, the full provisions of the Act will be effective.
And as we wrap, what are the essential points that you want the Jamaican citizenry to take away from the passage and coming into effect of the Microcredit Act?
We are building and deepening institutions in Jamaica. And in the passage of the Microcredit Act, what we're seeking to do is to broaden the access to financial products that are properly priced, that operate according to good and healthy practices for the Jamaican people. And because the recognition is that financial services, loans, and credit are at the heart of economic activity and commerce. And the more Jamaicans who have access to properly priced and properly conducted financial services, loan services, the better off Jamaica will be. And what the Act seeks to do is to bring the microcredit institutions under the regulatory ambit of the central bank, to make sure they're licensed, to make sure that all of their officers, directors, and shareholders are fit and proper, that they are above board people. The Act seeks to banish predatory lending practices and intimidatory practices using violence or threats, physical or otherwise, to collect money from customers, to promote competition in the space that will lead to better pricing for the Jamaican people, and to ensure that the microcredit space and sector is not left open to be abused by those who have criminal proceeds and seek to launder those proceeds through the microcredit space.
Minister, thank you for speaking to us about the Microcredit Act 2021.
Thank you for having me.